Hello everyone. I am Robin Silvestri, Executive Director of Save the Great South Bay. We are a 501c3 environmental nonprofit that advocates for and implements programs to protect and preserve Long Island's Great South Bay. Along the South Shore, there are some 50 creeks and rivers that run through 16 towns and villages, all flowing directly into the bay. The health of our bay depends upon clean waters entering it. We offer 3 programs at Save the Great South Bay. Our Creek Defender program works with community leaders, partners, educators, students, civic organizations, municipalities, political leaders, and others to clean up along these creeks and rivers. Through our Bay Friendly Yards program, we implement and plan native plantings to restore native habitat, improve soil resiliency, and provide another layer of protection from nitrogen entering our waters, whether it be from an individual's yard or municipal sunplants. The third prong of our efforts is the Great South Bay Oyster Project, through which we are gathering a coalition of stakeholders, from oyster farmers and baymen to leading scientists and other nonprofits, and leaders of similar efforts elsewhere to come together, share their information and experience to implement a shellfish restoration effort right here in the Great South Bay. As we all know, one oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water. Just imagine what a million or a billion oysters could do for the health and the clarity of the Great South Bay. So joining us today on that topic is Dr. Charlie Flagg of Stony Brook University's School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. And Dr. Flagg is a leading researcher who has studied the processes and modeling of coastal lagoons, in particular Southern Long Island's Great South Bay. He's used a combination of numerical modeling and observations to track tidal, buoyancy, atmospheric, and bottom groundwater forcing, offering a particularly efficient means of examining how these areas have and will change in response to man's activities. Currently, he is looking at the impact that breaches in Fire Island might have on the circulation and salinity distribution in the Great South Bay, and how bathymetric changes have altered the circulation and sediment transport in Jamaica Bay. So welcome, Dr. Flagg. We're happy to have you here today. Sounds like some very exciting work that you're working on, and we are interested to see how your research fits into the bigger puzzle of our Great South Bay Oyster Project. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, so this discussion is going to focus a little bit more on the circulation within the Great South Bay as compared to some of the talks I've given in the past, which focus more on the development of the breach at Old Inlet. So this is an effort that has been going on in one form or another for about 15 or 16 years. It's been 8 years since the breach opened, and so we have a lot of pre-breach information as well as post-breach information. And this is based upon observations at several spots along the shoreline of Great South Bay, as well as a significant circulation modeling effort has been carried out. The people who are important for participating in this thing are Claudia Hinrichs, a graduate student who's graduated a couple of years ago now, Roger Flood, who's done a lot of the bathymetric survey of Great South Bay and the breach, Bob Wilson, who's a physical oceanographer at Stony Brook, who's helped with various parts of this thing, as well as Henry Borkiewicz, whose interests are in shoreline processes and groundwater. So the beginning of perhaps this discussion starts with Hurricane Sandy, and this is a simulation of based upon observations of the wind field associated with Sandy as it came up the coast. So here you can see that it's starting in the Bahamas, moves up the coast. Now, one of the things that is interesting about Sandy is that it was very slow moving up the coast. And the other aspect about it is it was very large. So here it is approaching the mid-Atlantic bight, and you can see that it spans the whole distance between Cape Hatteras and Cape Cod. You also notice that the winds associated with it are relatively small for a hurricane. Maximum wind speeds are in the order of 40 or so meters per second, which is about 80 knots, which is just over Category 1 hurricane speed. Along the coast of Long Island, the speeds are substantially less, more in the range of about 40 or 50 knots. And you can see here as it's approaching the New York apex, the winds along the Long Island coast are relatively reduced, and in fact never get above about 45 or 50 knots. And then the hurricane disappears into Atlantic City and out of the picture. So here's a record from the National Data Buoy Office for the buoy 44025, which is located about 25 miles south of Long Island. And in this plots over here, we have the wind speed in knots, wave height in feet, and atmospheric pressure. The wind speed at the buoy never got to 50 knots. So it never really got to hurricane strength. Hurricane strength is about 55 knots. So it was substantially weaker than a hurricane. However, the duration of the wind forces are long. These ticks here that's a 3-day tick. So this was above storm sort of speeds at that buoy for almost 3 days. Here you see the wave height at the buoy, which reaches a little over 30 feet. And this is the significant wave height, which is the average of the top 15% of the wave. So if the average is 30 feet, then you can imagine that there are some waves that are even substantially larger. Down in this lower plot is the atmospheric pressure at the buoy, and it has dropped from about the normal of 1,010 millibars down to 960. That's 50 millibars, which is equivalent to 50 centimeters of water that is essentially sucked into the area. So even without the wind setup, you have the potential for a half a meter of water simply by reducing the atmospheric pressure. So all those things combine to impact the storm surge associated with Sandy. Now, we've been making measurements in the Great South Bay for a long time now, and one of our principal instruments is this device over here. It's called a CCAT. It is a device that measures temperature, salinity, pressure, in other words, water depth, and this black thing here measures chlorophyll and turbidity. So we have been deploying instruments like this at 5 or 6 locations around the shoreline, hanging from various docks. And we've been doing that, and that data is available on our website. You can Google Great South Bay Project, and you'll find the site. We've also been doing, since Sandy, we've been doing aerial overflights with and taking oblique shots and videos from which we can make mosaics of what's going on in the breach area. So this shows the location of the observation sites. So starting here in the Coast Guard base, along Barrett Beach, Bellport, Blue Point, Islip, Tanner Park, these two blue sites are USGS water level sites at Lindenhurst and Point Lookout. And I'll be using data from Lindenhurst and sea level set up as a result of storms. You'll see that shortly. So here's the pictures before and after of the breach area at Old Inlet. Up here we can see the old inlet, which was open between about 1760 and 1825. It was large. It was sufficient for ocean-going vessels to come in and out of the bay. And in fact, during the Revolution, a British warship came in. So the bottom picture shows it was formed. The breach went through this area over here where the dune had been reduced in height, and there was a nip in on the back shoreline, which had been used for boat storage in the past. Anyway, so this is where it came through. The width of the main channel here is about 150 feet or 30 meters. And so that's how it all started. Now, this plots, these pictures is designed to show how the coastal, well, the south side of the barrier island. So there's really two aspects to reinforcing in coastal lagoons, and it's particularly significant in a long coastal lagoon like Great South Bay. So the first thing that happens when the wind builds up is that there is a balance, a long bay balance between the wind stress and the sea surface slope. So the water slopes up, downwind, and it balances the wind stress. So there's a pressure pushing the water back, and the wind stress is pushing the water downwind. And in Great South Bay, if you using the data from Bellport and Lindenhurst, the balance, the difference in water level between Bellport and Lindenhurst is given by this equation, where this U is the velocity of the wind in meters per second, and multiply that times the coefficient 0.003, and you can get the height difference between Bellport and Lindenhurst. And this happens very quickly. So over here on the right side is a plot of the correlation between wind direction and lag and the amplitude of the water level difference between Bellport and Lindenhurst. And the white dots show the point at which the correlation is a maximum. And so what happens here is that within a couple of hours, when the winds blow out of the northeast at about 70 degrees true, that's when the setup between Bellport and Lindenhurst is the maximum. And so, and the opposite happens when the wind blows out of the west. So the point here is that this response is very fast, within an hour or so. Essentially, there's an immediate balance between the sea surface slope and the wind stress in Great South Bay. So in terms of Hurricane Sandy or a typical nor'easter, the very first thing that happens is that the water level in Bellport drops, and the water level at Lindenhurst goes up. After a while, there will be a setup against the coast. If the wind is blowing from the east to the west, there'll be a setup against the coast. It looks like this. And this takes a while to occur. So over here is the correlation between the mean water level, so the average between Bellport and Lindenhurst, and the time lag and the direction. So this shows that it takes about 24 hours or 20 some hours for the response of the bay to respond to what's going on offshore. So it takes about 12 hours or so for the ocean to set up like this if the wind is steadily out of the northeast. And then it takes some time for this water to flow into the bay. So the ocean sets up at about 12 hours. It takes another 12 hours for the bay to set up. And so at that point, you've already set up a slant downstream slope to the bay water level, and then the whole shooting match comes up. And that's how the storm surges occur in the bay. So this is a records of water level at various locations and salinity at Bellport. So the red line, the red solid line, is the water level at Bellport as Hurricane Sandy passed over. So initially what happens is that as the wind starts to blow intensely in the Great South Bay, the water levels at Bellport drop. Then the breach happened and the ocean comes flooding in, and there's an immediate increase in water level. Now this is not insignificant. Here is the 0 and this is 1.5. So within 2 or 3 hours, the water level had gone from essentially mean water level all the way up to 1.5 meters above mean water level. The black line is what's happening in the ocean just offshore. And you can see that it was building up over a period of a couple of days and reached the maximum as the storm went by. People have pointed out that if Sandy had passed over this area during low tide, the impact would have been quite substantially less. But anyways, this is what happened here. This is when the breach finally happened. The dashed line, red dashed line, is the salinity at Bellport, and it wanders around 24 or 25 parts per thousand. Immediately drops right before the hurricane, the breach, and this is the drainage of the creeks in the Carmel River just upstream. And then the breach happened and the salinity jumped all the way up to almost 30 parts per thousand. The ocean salinity is around 32, so this has almost reached ocean salinity. So here's this diagram is going to show you the size of the breach area in terms of cross-sectional area. Roger Flood and I did a lot of bathymetric surveying over the first 2 or 3 years. And so here's a profile, and it shows the maximum depths are nearly 6 meters. And the width of the thing is somewhat less than 100 meters across. The cross-sectional area of the whole breach area typically was around 400 square meters. And so that said, it increased to that size fairly quickly. And there was a couple of times when it was bigger, but then it seemed to have settled back down to about 400. So that seems to be the typical size of the breach. Model conditions that you'll see later were based upon data from September 2016. So we also went out to measure the water velocity as it passed through the breach. And we did this during an ebb tide, and this is showing the transport in meters cubed per second as a function of time during one ebb period. You'll notice that it's, first off, it's not symmetric, and the maximum velocity transports out were close to 450 cubic meters per second. If you're thinking about gallons, there's 264 gallons per cubic meter. So multiply this number times 264 if you want to get gallons. So the total transport, if you integrate all the water that passed through during this period, it's about 5.7 times 10 to the 6 cubic meters. And the tidal prism, that is the distance, the volume of water between low water and high water in Bellport Bay, this area between Smith Point and South Howells Point here, is the cross section of the area there is 18 square kilometers, and the tidal prism is about 6 times 10 to the 6 meters cubed, which is essentially the same as the transport through the breach here. And so the breach transport is sufficient to supply the tidal prism for that entire area, which is one of the reasons that its impact was quite noticeable in terms of water quality. So as I said, we've done some overflights of the area. This is a typical track where we fly over and do several flight tracks across the area with a video camera, and that's used to produce these photo mosaics by patching together all the little pictures from the video. So here's the picture of the breach 5 months after Sandy went by. Here's the scale. These two pictures are essentially on the same scale. And so you can see that initially the breach main channel was a little less than 100 meters. Here it is after 7 years. So this channel is about the same, but the distance between dry land and dry land is now nearly 500 meters, half a kilometer. That's compared to 200 meters or so over here. So this shows you the changes that are taking place. The biggest change, perhaps, is the development of this flood delta. And it's a very shallow area. A lot of this area becomes dry at low tide, and over here as well. So a lot of sand has moved into this area. This area used to be somewhere between 3 and 4 feet deep. It was called the flats, but now it is even shallower. So what has happened in terms of the water within the bay? This shows the salinity before and after, the histograms of before and after salinity at 3 locations. Salinity is a marker for the exchange between the ocean and the bay. The bay's sort of natural salinity is about 24, and the ocean's salinity is about 32. So the higher the salinity, it indicates more ocean waters coming in. So here we have at the Coast Guard base in the Fire Island Inlet, essentially no change. Blue is before, red is after the breach. As we move to the east, this is Barrett Beach. Here's the before. The typical values here might be 25, 26, and they've moved up to somewhere between 28 and 29, with some occasional even higher values. Increase from around averaging around 25 to somewhere around 29. This is now a little dated. The breach has gotten a little smaller, so the average salinities in Bellport have shifted down to somewhere around 28, 27, and 28. So what has this done for the water quality? Well, as you can see from this plot, based upon sampling stations. These are the sampling stations from the Suffolk County Department of Health Services, and they make these observations essentially once a month, and they've been doing this for 30 years or so. But these are essentially surface samples, or within the first meter or so. The arrows show the change between before and after the breach was formed in terms of nitrogen concentration and chlorophyll concentration. So the reds represent nitrogen. And you can see in the eastern Great South Bay and the western Mauritius Bay that both the nitrogen and the chlorophyll have dropped significantly. These guys without any arrows on them means that the change was not statistically significant. So the impact here has been quite noticeable, and the water clarity has obviously increased. You can see it, and this has been accompanied by increased clam growth and the presence of fish that have not been seen in any numbers in the bay for quite some time. For reasons that aren't really quite clear, some of these western areas seem to have seen an increase of both nitrogen and chlorophyll when we don't really understand what's going on there. So the other aspect of the breach and people's interest is whether or not it was going to cause flooding. Here's a plot of water levels at Lindenhurst since 2007. So you can see here's the impact of Sandy, where the water level went up to about 2 meters in Lindenhurst. So this is a combination of both the Along Bay increase, a slope of the water level, and the ocean's impact. So the combination produced nearly 2 meters as compared to something on the order of 1.5 meters in Bellport. So aside from Sandy and this other Hurricane Irene, the storm surges before and after are very similar. And here's a histogram that shows the water levels at Lindenhurst, and blue represents the period before the breach, and red represents the statistics after the breach. And they look very similar. If you blow up this area down here, where between 0.5 meter and above, you can see that after Sandy, there is an increase in some of the number of high water events that you might see at these various levels. The problem with describing these increases in water levels is a little tricky, because shortly after Sandy happened, there was a major dredging operation in Fire Island Inlet. And Fire Island Inlet is by far and away the most important of the openings to the Great South Bay. It's 10 or more times larger than the breach, and it's larger than Mauritius or Jones by a significant margin. So exactly who caused this is a little uncertain. But the general picture is such that it doesn't appear that the breach has had a major impact. Okay, so now we're going to try and look at some of the other features of a larger scale. And we're going to use the model that we developed, the dynamic model, driven by tides, winds, and heat flux, atmospheric heat flux. It has rivers and groundwater portions as well. This diagram over here shows the grid in the breach area, and it's based upon the hydrographic data from Roger floods in my surveys of the breach itself, and USGS overflights using LiDAR in the flood delta area. And while the breach doesn't look anything like this at this point, this is what the model has been using. So how is this impacting the Great South Bay? So one feature is to look at residence times and how long it takes to change the properties in an area. So one area obviously is the Bellport Bay area, and so we filled up this whole bay with dye and released it and looked at where it would go in the conditions from before the breach and including the breach. So here's where the dye is located 7 days after it was released. And so this is under tidal forcing, so there's no winds going on. So you can see that still most of it is in Bellport Bay. Some of it has gone into the narrow channel here. And then after two weeks, it's begun to spread into Patchon Bay and into the western Mauritius Bay. If you include the impact of the breach, after 7 days, you can see immediately the impact of the ocean water coming in, and that the dye has reached farther into Patchon Bay and is past Blue Point at this point. And here it's completely filled up by Patchon Bay and is now south of Sayville. And a lot of the water has gone into Mauritius Bay, and you can see that some of the water has disappeared into the ocean. Some of the dye has disappeared into the ocean. So clearly the impact of the breach was reduced the residence time. And here's a plot of the total amount of total relative amount of dye in Bellport Bay as a function of time. So this is days down here, and the blue is what it would do without the breach, and the red is what it does with the breach. And so we typically use 1 over E as what's called the e-foaming time as an indicator of residence time. So after somewhere between 17 and 19 days, the water has dropped over by some large proportion, as compared to 5 days or so when the breach is present. So obviously there's been a huge reduction in residence time. So that's one major impact of the breach. Now, the other aspect is how does the bay as a whole respond to ocean forcing? So what we've been running the model with an outer boundary that was forced by the tide, so primarily the semidiurnal tide. So it's a 12-hour tide. So we thought, well, what happens if we examine this by looking at a 12-hour tide, a 24-hour tide, and 36, 74-hour tide? See how long it takes to fill up the bay if we do that. So here's a plot of maximum elevation at a number of locations from Tanner Park in the west to Mauritius Bay in the east. And the blue is no breach, and the yellow is with a breach. And the little numbers up here say that indicate the difference between the before and after breach form. And so this is for a 12-hour period, essentially a standard semidiurnal tide. And you can see that, let's say at Bellport, which is right here, the maximum, this is, to back up a bit, we're forcing the ocean with a 1 meter tide. So 1 meter, and by the maximum tide we get at Bellport is a little over 1/3 of a meter, which is exactly what we see typically in the bay now. So areas closer to Fire Island Inlet, obviously see the larger tide, and those closer to Mauritius Inlet, the bigger tide. Here's the breach, and without the breach itself, it looked just like Bellport, just across the bay. With the breach, it has increased obviously substantially. If we look at longer period tides, you can see that it takes more water is coming in. And as we go to 24-hour tides, so Bellport had been something like a third of a meter. It is now a little over a half a meter. So in 24 hours, we get essentially 50% of what's going on in the ocean. If we go 36 hours, we're now at close to 75% of what's happening in the ocean. And notice that the differences between the east-west differences disappear, because it doesn't matter how close you are to Fire Island Inlet when you give it this much time. So here's 2 days, 48 hours, 80%. And in the 3-day event, we're almost close to 100%. So in 3 days, if the ocean goes up, we're going to see the entire impact of the ocean. So this illustrates a couple of points. One is hurricanes come through, they have a lot of wind, and they knock down trees and power lines and all that sort of stuff, but they typically blow through in 12 hours or less. And so their water level impact is relatively small. Nor'easters, on the other hand, can sit on us for a couple of days. So, and they can do a substantial setup. So oftentimes, nor'easters cause much more flooding than a hurricane does. It doesn't typically knock quite so many trees down, but it definitely floods the low-lying areas. So what is this? What do the currents in the Great South Bay look like? Well, this is streamlines from a simulation just with tides, no winds and no storms. And so this is just tidally driven, with the water going up and down in the ocean, driving the flow through tidal inputs through the breaching, through the. So you can see that typically the mean currents tend to be a bunch of swirls and sort of relatively disorganized flow patterns throughout the entire Great South Bay. With the breach, we have a change. The breach over here, we now have a mean flow that is coming out of Bellport Bay into Patchogue Bay and into the area of the south of Savion. You'll notice that it looks like even the eddies, which to the west, which are about in the same location, are stronger than they are without the breach. So the general circulation within the bay seems to have intensified, but the mean flow to the west is more or less confined to the eastern half of the Great South Bay. Not much difference is happening here in Southwestern Bay. So, well, what does this do in terms of long-term transports? This is a picture of the transports at several sections throughout the bay, driven by tides and tidal fluctuations in the conditions before the breach. And you can see that the numbers are in the order of, these are meters cubed per second. So the residual flow across these sections is something on the order of 15 or so meters cubed per second. And you can see that here the mean flow is in Mauritius Bay, it's in Jones Inlet, it's out at East Rockaway, and most of the flow out is happening at in Fire Island. And here in the Oyster Bay area, the mean flow is to the east, and to the west, to the east of that, it's to the west. So there's a convergence, and the flow is out of Fire Island Inlet. With the advent of the breach is a highly nonlinear, because of the complex symmetry. The breach is a highly nonlinear process, and that produces a net flow in. This is the residual after you have a high tide and a low tide. 60 cubic meters per second. I have to think about how that compares to 450 cubic meters per second at the maximum ebb and the maximum flood. So this is a relatively small number compared to the instantaneous flow, but on average, you have an inflow here at Fire Island. It reduces the mean inflow at Mauritius. In fact, seems to have turned it around. But there is still a mean flow to the west through the Narrows, and we have increased from something on the order of 15 cubic meters per second to something on the order of 60 cubic meters per second mean flow to the west. The flow here out of Oyster Bay has been reduced, but it's still to the east. This flow here is a little more complicated because it comes out through some of these channels. The big change, however, is that the flow out of Fire Island Inlet has doubled. The residual flow is doubled to nearly 80 cubic meters per second. Jones is still in, and Rockaway is still out. So those are the big changes that have happened as a result of the breach, which has encouraged this mean flow to the west and a general increase in the exchange between the ocean and the bay for almost the entire Great South Bay. Here's a little simulation to give you an idea of how the water moves. So these are surface markers that under tidal forcing, and so we have a couple of cartoons here that we can run. So you can see these things sloshing back and forth, and with particles being ejected from Fire Island Inlet and Mauritius Inlet, and even the breach here. Right here, here's the breach. So as you can see here, there's the general migration of the particles to the west into Patchong Bay, and this, you can see that there's now a big difference between these parts, at least as far as Connecticut. So this is what's happening. So this is after quite a number of tidal cycles. This is coming up on 10 days. So if we look at what here's after 172 hours, so 8 days or so, you can see that there's a substantial difference between where the particles ended up after 8 days. Although the particle distribution here in the sort of the middle of the bay, the western part, looks very similar. So that's generally how the flow patterns are in this area. And so that's what I have to say about the flow patterns. I have one more thing that I think is important for people to understand, and that has to do with sea level rise. So this is the monthly average water levels at the Battery Park, southern Manhattan, since 1900 through 2014. There has been a general increase in water level. So this is in meters, so it went almost a third of a meter So over this period, that's a little over a foot. And it's been rising over that entire period at around 3 millimeters per year. The last 20 or so years, 25 years, it's now close to 5 millimeters per year. Here's the record, a little more recent record from 1990 through 2015 for Sandy Hook and Montauk. They are now rising at something on the order of 6 millimeters per year. Doesn't sound like much. It's about a quarter of an inch a year. To put it in perspective, here is the water level of the entire world's ocean over the last 24,000 years. So 15 or 16,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice over Long Island, and that started to melt in about 16,000 years ago. And as it melted throughout the world, all that ice, water level increased. It increased from about 120 meters down to current water levels. The seashore, when the sea level was 120 meters down, was about 75 miles south of Long Island at the edge of the continental shelf. So during this period, from about 15,000 to 8,000 years ago, water level was going up at around 15 millimeters per year. After about 8,000 years ago, it stopped. We melted as much as we were going to melt, and sea level has remained essentially constant for the last 7,000 years. The blue line shows the what 5 millimeters per year looks like. The red line shows what 10 millimeters per year looks like. We are currently in this neck of the woods. We're now going up at 5 millimeters per year. So, and in many cases, especially if Antarctica starts melting and Greenland starts melting faster than it is currently, we're going to be pushing down toward 10 millimeters per year, and you can see that this is going to have a rather dramatic impact. So that's about all I have to say on the various subjects, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flagg. That last slide is actually particularly stunning at a quarter of an inch rise per year. That's a shocking number.
Okay, it's the other one aspect about that is that various people have looked at sort of beaches that are natural beaches, not that haven't been maintained by people, and they've figured out that when the water goes up by 1 unit, the beach retreats by somewhere between 100 and 200 units. So over the last century, the water has gone up a foot. So all the natural beaches have retreated somewhere between 100 and 200 feet.
Yeah.
And as they project another half meter or so of sea level rise, that means the beaches are going to retreat somewhere between 50 and 100 meters. There are a lot of houses within 50 or 100 meters of shoreline.
And what did you say the time span was on that retreat?
You mean the last 100 years? The water has gone up a foot.
Right. Okay. So over the course of the next 100 years, we can expect to lose between 50 and 100 more feet of.
Well, even more. It's not. It's the sea level rise is accelerating. Right. It's not going up at 3 millimeters per year. It's going up at 5 or 6 millimeters per year and accelerating.
Right. Okay, Dr. Flagg, could I ask you to go back to the particle movement slide?
Yep. This one or the video one?
I like this one with I like both of them actually. There's interesting data to be gleaned from both of them for the purposes of the Great South Bay Oyster Project. We are looking, of course, to put oysters back where they once were. And there are a couple of factors that would affect that. One being the movement of the water now that the breach is open again. To the sea level rise because oysters don't like to be submerged constantly. Um, and so I'm curious, is
Well,
this
there.
information available live or in ArcGIS? How is this information presented?
Well, I have the output from the model, and it
Mhm.
is not in general accessible to the general public.
Right, I see.
It's not that we're trying to be. It's not that we're trying to be coy about it. It's just that the data formats and things like that are a little arcane, and they're not in tables that people can easily access. The data is simply too voluminous for that.
Right.
So, but if people are interested in it, we can um, pull out the data and do some simulations. Uh, um, Chris Gobler asked if we would look at what would happen if oysters spawned in this neck of the woods of South Oyster Bay. And so we ran a simulation. We put essentially these are like spat.
Right.
So where would they go in any reasonable amount of time? So the thinking was, well, this looks like a pretty calm area. Maybe the spats will just stay there. Well, the simulations suggest that they immediately pick up and start moving to the east.
Mm-hmm.
And so within a week or so, they're mostly over here. So if you were hoping that you would end up with a lot of oysters here, then you would be a little disappointed because they were all the spots were in this neck of the woods. And some of them actually made it out Fire Island. So
So
that
following
was under
that,
tidal force.
right.
That was under tidal forcing only. So
Mhm.
wind events can have a substantial impact on things. Not only do they change the water level, they also can change the flow patterns and completely reverse the currents from the tidal norm. Uh, and so there are a lot of things going on that are not just um, tides.
Absolutely. I particularly found interesting the particle movement slide, the pre and post Sandy breach out at Bellport, how things have moved. Has any modeling been done specifically for shellfish in the central or not as far as Oyster Bay, but the western Great South Bay?
Well, I haven't done any, nobody's asked for has identified a spot that they want to deploy, or try to reseed the oysters or clams in this neck of the woods. So we've done a simulation here in Bellport Bay. People were putting clams, I think, in this neck of the woods and over here along Shirley. And the question was how is it going to be, how long would they might stay? So we've done that. So we've done it at one end, and then the other end of Great South Bay. We haven't done anything in the middle. Ice lip is in this over here,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the ice lip has a hatchery, and they've been trying to reseed this area without a heck of a lot of success for a decade or more. So reseeding the clams is difficult. At one point, there were over 100 per square meter, and it takes that kind of density to make sure that the spats get fertilized and that there's some reasonably comfortable place to settle.
Right. They do have a very high mortality rate.
Yes.
So with the breach, I know Friends of Bellport Bay has been quite successful in planting and are reproducing their clams and shellfish out in the eastern part of the bay.
But
How has and their effort has taken place over the past 5 years. Has
they, uh, those guys, there's an island right here just to the
right,
um,
Pelican Island, is it?
west of the breach. It's Ridge. It's
Mm,
called Ridge Island.
gotcha.
Pelican Island is right in the middle of the breach itself.
Mhm,
But this is Ridge Island, and they tucked in a place behind Ridge Island where uh, the they were worried about the ice scouring various places, so they got into a place where the ice wouldn't do it, and where the water was fairly shallow. And apparently that's worked fairly well. They've got some quite significant sized oysters to grow there. There's other efforts over here. I think they're either clams or oysters in this neck of the woods, but I
mhm,
haven't really been following all that
mhm.
closely.
Okay. So if the Fire Island Inlet were to be dredged, or what recently was dredged, what effect does that have on the drift patterns?
Well, Fire Island runs the show. Fire Island runs the show. It is uh, 10 or more times bigger than the breach, and it's 5 times bigger than than Mauritius. And Jones Inlet, which is off here to the left, is sort of separated by all these islands and narrow channels. So it has a much lesser impact on the bay than anything else. So Fire Island Inlet runs the show, as you say.
Mhm.
And um, it is constantly filling in, um, oops, and um, has to be dredged at a regular interval, if not even faster. Um, if you take a boat through the opening of Fire Island Inlet, I've done it a few times, not too many times, but the navigation buoys are high and dry. They're 100 meters in the wrong place because, and the Coast Guard is constantly trying to move them around, trying to keep them in place. The place is just silting up as fast as it can.
Right.
150 or 200 years ago, Fire Island Inlet was right here, and just to the west of the Fire Island Light, which is about there. And so I think that light was put in like 1830, something like that. So since 1830 and now, the Fire Island or Democrat Point has moved some 5 miles to the west.
Mhm.
And so, that is the fate of breaches. And so the breach at Old Inlet is going to do the same thing, except that nobody is there dredging it. So its lifetime I'm actually surprised that it's remained open for 8 years. But you know, the vicissitudes of breaches in barrier islands are substantial. They typically close. They form and then they close. And they form and they close. Used to be a whole slew of breaches along this area between Jones Beach and Gilgo Beach. This used to be a sort of a string of islands with plenty of breaches in between. And you can see that was so by all these Back Bay Islands. These are all made by the sand that came in through these breaches.
Mhm.
So that's a hallmark of breaches.
Now, I know you were working on kind of a separate topic, but working on some studies for the possible opening of an inlet at Gilgo. What kind of impact would that have on the Western Bay? And it's not, when I say opening of an inlet, it's like
Well,
restoring an inlet that was once there.
we don't know for sure.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, I don't think that cuts any mustard. The This is the area of where they're proposing that a engineered inlet be installed. And the advantages of that are that it's in a natural, in a park, so there are no houses or any major infrastructure. There's Ocean Beach Parkway, which goes right through here, and so that's an issue. But this is a very narrow area, so the possibility of an inlet here is perhaps attractive. This area back here, where you're trying, the idea is to increase the flushing for this southwest Bay area. The area right here is very shallow, and there's a lot of clam activity, and people are very happy to have those clams and the eelgrass. And so if you have to do some dredging in order to get access to this area, that's going to cause some problems. Whether or not this is going to silt in immediately is another issue.
Right.
The concept is to have gates to prevent storm surge. That would be an absolute requirement as far as the people who live along the shore is concerned. Well, the gates can be done for two things. They can be closed if there's going to be a major storm. That's obvious. The other point is that you could use them, you could close the gates on flood and open them on ebb. And that would have, so then you would have a net flow out of this area. And that might prevent the sand buildup, which is going to be a major concern. The other point is that when you have a breach like this with the 450 cubic meters going in and per second and coming out in a second, the water that goes in, a large portion of it goes back out again. So your net can be small. If you had a gate so that you only allow water out at something close to 400 cubic meters per second, you would have a much bigger impact than simply letting the water slosh back and forth. And so the inlet, the breach, this one is 400 meters squared. You might be able to get away with something considerably less if you can direct the flow only in one direction. So all these things have to be studied, and with circulation models similar to the one that we use, and in order to see if this thing is actually worthwhile in terms of flushing. And then of course you have all the engineering issues, which are going to be quite substantial. And you have an environmental impact statement, which is going to be some kind of circus.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Flagg. I think our big takeaways from today are that there are particle movement models out there. There have been studies that are done that show how spat would move around the bay, possibly move around the bay based on the modeling, and that there are measuring stations throughout the bay, multiple measuring stations where we can collect data on the health of the Great South Bay. So these are really great pieces of our puzzle. So I want to thank you very much for your time today. And we hope that you will share your presentation with us so we can share it further.
Okay, no problem.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Flagg, and we'll talk soon.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. This is Robin Silvestri from Save the Great South Bay. Join us again next week for our speaker series with Dr. Chris Gobler on the state of the Bay, where he will be presenting 13 years worth of data on the health of the Great South Bay and where we currently are today. That's next Friday, November 20th at noon. Registration is available on Eventbrite. Thank you very much.